On the edge of the Texas plains, a poor farmer shared his broken-down house with 3 abandoned foals. Life was quiet, fragile, and barely holding together, until the night thunder split the sky and a massive black stallion crashed through his door, bleeding and wild. From that moment, nothing in the farmer's life, or the foals, would ever be the same. The late afternoon sun burned over the flat Texas fields, turning the dry stalks of last year's grass into brittle gold. The air was heavy, the kind of still heat that pressed down until every sound seemed slower, duller. At the edge of a dirt road that barely earned a name, a weathered wooden house stood, patched together with mismatched boards like an old soldier's jacket sewn from scraps. Inside that crooked house, Jack Turner, 52, leaned on a broom handle, his knees creaking with every step. He had already scattered hay across the living room floor, now more barn than parlor. 3 young foals nosed through it eagerly, tails flicking, their small hooves clicking against warped planks. The smell of hay, sharp, green, and sweet, mingled with the resin of pine wood and the faint metallic tang of well water. Jack had long ago stopped caring what neighbors thought of him. The house was his, and if it no longer held couches or rugs, but instead carried the breath and warmth of horses, so be it. Rose, the chestnut filly with wide, luminous eyes, raised her head when he passed, her nostrils twitching for the apple slice she knew he carried in his pocket. Dusty, sandy-coated, and restless, tried to nudge her aside, only to be swatted by Jack's calloused hand and a muttered, "Mind your manners." In the corner, Small Blue, pale gray and thin-boned, chewed slowly. Each bite fragile, as if the world could take it away again at any second. Jack lowered himself into a chair that had survived the conversion of the room. He ran a palm across his forehead, wiping away sweat that stung his eyes. Outside, the cicadas screamed their endless summer song, and from the battered radio on the shelf came a country tune sung in a voice that cracked with age. The words about losing and keeping on didn't need explaining. Jack knew them in his bones. For years after his wife passed, silence had filled this house like water in a cracked cup. Never enough to quench, but always too heavy to carry. He'd worked odd jobs, mending fences, hauling hay, even driving cattle for a neighbor when the pay was right. But nights were the worst. Nights when the boards popped and the wind whispered through mesquite trees, reminding him no one waited on the porch light anymore. Then came the foals, each in their own way abandoned, each showing up in his life because someone else couldn't or wouldn't care. Jack never said the word family, but when he saw Rose's ears flick toward him, or Dusty's stubborn kick at the door, or Blue's shy, desperate glance, something inside his chest eased. He leaned forward, dropping another flake of hay into the pile, his voice soft, though no one but horses could hear it. "This old place isn't much, but it'll do for us." The fan above him clattered, stirring the thick air. His boots tapped against the worn boards, keeping time with the song still spilling from the radio. Jack let his eyes close for just a moment, listening not only to the music, but to the steady rhythm of chewing and the occasional snort that meant his living room was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. A shadow crossed the doorway. He glanced up, but it was only the evening sun shifting behind the cottonwoods. Yet for an instant, he felt something. A weight of waiting, like the hush before a storm. He straightened, rubbing his chest where the ache of solitude sometimes flared. "Eat up," he said to the foals, as though they might be listening. "Tomorrow's another hot one." The words hung in the dusty air, simple and ordinary. But even as he said them, Jack couldn't shake the strange tremor of knowing. Tomorrow would not be ordinary at all. The next morning broke hot and hazy, as if the storm that had threatened yesterday had only retreated to sharpen its teeth for later. Jack stepped out onto the porch, pulling his hat low against the already fierce sun. The ground smelled of dust and mesquite, that stubborn perfume of Texas land baked too long under the sky. His boots sank into the powdery dirt as he walked toward the well, the handle squealing in protest when he drew up a bucket of water. Behind him, the foals stirred. Rose whinnied first, her call sharp and impatient. Dusty followed, kicking the stall partition Jack had built out of old cedar planks. Blue, as always, only peeked around the edge, waiting for reassurance. Jack hauled the bucket inside, filled their trough, and watched as they pressed close, drinking as if the world might end before they finished. That was when he noticed the figure at the fence. A thin boy, no more than 14, leaned against the weathered posts. His jeans were torn at the knee, and his shirt clung with sweat. He didn't call out, only raised a hand in a quiet greeting. Jack squinted. "Morning," he said, voice gravelly. "Morning, Mr. Turner." The boy's voice carried a shy note, but also something steady. "Pa's still on the road. Asked if I could come by. See if you needed help." Jack studied him. Ethan Miller. He'd seen the boy now and then, never with his mother, who'd left years ago. Folks in town whispered about it, the kind of gossip Jack ignored. He only knew the boy had more hours alone than a child should. "You know anything about horses?" Jack asked. "Not much," Ethan admitted, "but I can learn." Something about the honesty in the boy's eyes made Jack nod. He gestured toward the door. "Come on, then. They'll teach you quicker than I can." Ethan stepped into the dim interior, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the cool shade. Raised her head immediately, ears flicking toward the newcomer. Dusty stamped the floor, restless. Blue hung back, wide-eyed. "They got names?" Ethan asked, voice hushed, as though he'd walked into a church. Jack pointed. "Rose, Dusty, and the little gray one's Blue. You keep your movements slow. Let them decide if they want to come to you." The boy knelt, extending his hand the way Jack had once shown a neighbor's kid. Rose sniffed, then pressed her nose briefly against his fingers. Ethan smiled. Small, unguarded, the kind of smile Jack realized he hadn't seen in years within these walls. By noon, Ethan had carried water, swept hay, and learned to cut apple slices into thin wedges so the foals wouldn't choke. He worked without complaint, though sweat plastered his hair to his forehead. When Jack told him to take a break, Ethan shook his head. "I like it here," he said simply. The words sank deeper than Jack expected. He thought of the mortgage notice folded on the table, the reminder that the land and house weren't his forever unless he kept up payments. He thought of the insurance forms he'd ignored, the letters from county offices with their cold language. None of that felt real compared to this boy kneeling in hay dust, laughing quietly when Dusty tried to steal his cap. Later they sat on the porch, drinking well water that tasted faintly of iron. The cicadas were deafening, and somewhere beyond the cottonwoods a hawk screamed. Ethan asked, "Why'd you take them in?" "The foals, Jack rubbed his jaw. "Because nobody else would." He let the silence stretch. "And maybe because I needed someone around who wasn't just me." Ethan didn't answer right away. He leaned his head against the porch post, eyes half closed. "Feels different here." "Like It doesn't matter if you don't have much, long as you belong. Jack glanced at him. The boy's words cut closer than any sermon. He thought of his wife, of nights when the house had been full of her humming. He thought of empty years after she passed, of meals eaten in silence. He thought of this moment. 2 glasses of water, a boy at his porch, 3 foals asleep in the shade. For the first time in too long, he felt the weight in his chest shift just a little. The day wore on. Together they fixed a loose hinge on the back gate, Ethan steadying the plank while Jack hammered. Dusty nosed at the boy's elbow the whole time, demanding attention. Rose and Blue stayed near the door, calmer now with company. As the sun dipped low, they spread hay once more. Jack stood watching while Ethan crouched, murmuring softly to Blue, coaxing her closer. The filly's hesitant steps, the boy's gentle patience, it stirred something quiet but undeniable in the room. When it was done, Jack closed the door against the deepening dark. The air smelled of cut grass, sweat, and the faint sweetness of apples. Ethan lingered on the porch, shoulders slouched as though he dreaded returning to his own empty house. "Come back tomorrow," Jack said at last. The words surprised even him. "Plenty more to do." Ethan nodded, his eyes lighting with something unspoken. He started down the path toward the fence, then paused, glancing back. "Thanks, Mr. Turner." Jack only tipped his hat, watching as the boy disappeared into the dusk. Inside, the foals shifted, settling for the night. Outside, the cicadas hushed, replaced by the low, rising hum of wind. Jack felt it then. The same tremor he'd noticed the night before. A waiting. The air too heavy, the silence too sharp, like the world drawing a long breath before breaking. He rubbed his chest again, uneasy. And though he didn't know why, he whispered into the dark, "Tomorrow won't be like today." By late afternoon, the horizon to the west had darkened into bruised purple. Clouds dragged low across the sky, their bellies swollen, heavy with rain that hadn't touched this ground in weeks. The mesquite trees beyond the fence bent in the wind, their branches whispering like dry bones rubbing together. Jack stood on the porch, hands on his hips, staring at the rolling wall of thunderclouds. He knew this land. Storms here didn't come gently. They came hard, fast, and mean. Inside the house, the foals grew restless. Rose tossed her head, ears pricked at each distant rumble. Dusty pawed the boards as though the ground itself were vibrating. Blue pressed against the wall, eyes wide and glassy, already sensing a danger bigger than she could understand. Jack set down the coil of rope he'd been holding and sighed, the sound caught between frustration and resignation. "Best get ready," he muttered, half to himself. Ethan had arrived earlier than usual, carrying a dented lunchbox and a hammer he'd borrowed from his father's shed. Now he knelt by the back wall, securing loose boards Jack hadn't gotten around to fixing. The boy's thin shoulders worked with surprising determination, sweat glistening across his neck. He didn't complain when the nails bent or the wood splintered. He only tried again, as if the effort itself mattered more than the result. Jack handed him another board. "Storm like this'll test everything we've built," he said. Ethan didn't look up. "Then we'll fix what breaks." There was something steady in the boy's tone that made Jack pause. It had been years since anyone had spoken with him as though "we" was more than just a word. He nodded slowly, then turned toward the house. They worked in silence for an hour. Jack spread extra hay in the stalls, his hands moving with the muscle memory of a farmer who had mended barns his whole life. He checked the water barrels, filled them to the brim in case the pump failed during the storm. Ethan carried feed sacks inside, stacking them neatly along the wall where the boards were strongest. With each trip, the boy brushed Dusty's shoulder or murmured something to Rose, gestures so natural it seemed he'd known them far longer than a week. As the sky grew darker, the air thickened. Heat pressed against them, sticky, suffocating. A smell rose from the earth. Ozone and dust mingled with the sharp tang of mesquite. It was the scent of a land bracing for violence. Jack lit a lantern, the flames struggling against the drafts sneaking through the seams of the old house. Shadows jumped across the walls, stretching the Foals into giants, then shrinking them again with each flicker. Ethan stopped to watch, his face caught between awe and unease. "Ever been through one out here?" Jack asked. Ethan shook his head. "Just rainstorms in town?" "Not like this," Jack grunted. "This one's got teeth." He leaned down to adjust Blue's feed bucket, speaking softer now. "Don't worry, little girl. You're safe in here." The first crack of thunder rolled across the land, so deep it rattled the boards under their feet. Dusty snorted, jerking against the makeshift stall. Rose stamped once, then settled only when Ethan laid a steady hand on her neck. Jack saw it, the boy's calm seeping into the animal like water into dry ground. Lightning split the horizon, white and violent, illuminating the hills in stark relief. For a heartbeat, the world seemed carved from silver, then plunged back into shadow. Jack felt the old ache in his chest again, that awareness he'd carried for days now, that life had shifted, though he couldn't yet name how. "Get the shutters," he ordered, and Ethan scrambled to obey, slamming them shut with both hands. The wind picked up, whistling through cracks, rattling the tin roof like a warning drum. The storm had not yet reached them, but its presence filled the house. Every sound, the creak of wood, the shuffle of hooves, the whisper of hay, was amplified, as though the world were holding its breath. Jack set the lantern on the table and wiped his brow. "They'll be fine," Ethan said quietly, his eyes on the Foals. "As long as we're with them." Jack studied him. The boy's words were simple, but they struck deeper than most prayers. He reached for his hat, pulling it down tight as another gust shook the walls. "Then we'll be with them." Outside, the clouds roared closer, swallowing the sun entirely. The horizon was gone, erased by sheets of dark that moved like a living thing. Jack tightened his grip on the lantern, the flame trembling as though it, too, feared what was coming. And in that tense silence, as the first drops spattered against the roof like thrown stones, Jack knew the storm was only the beginning. The storm hit just after sundown. Rain slammed against the tin roof in angry sheets, a sound so relentless it drowned out the radio and the cicadas alike. The house shuddered under each gust of wind, as though some invisible hand pressed hard against its sides. Jack and Ethan had finished fastening the shutters, but they both knew the wood was tired. The nails rusted. Inside, the Foals were restless. Rose circled her stall, ears pinned flat at every thunderclap. Dusty kicked against the boards, frustrated and scared. Blue buried her nose into the corner, trembling, as if she could hide from the sky itself. The lantern flickered on the table, its glow stretching across walls that seemed to pulse with every crack of lightning. "Stay calm," Jack murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the horses, the boy, or himself. Then came the sound, different from thunder, deeper than wind. A pounding, rhythmic and urgent. Hooves. Ethan froze. "Mr. Turner, do you hear that?" Jack already had. He set the lantern down, grabbed his old flashlight, and stepped toward the door. Another boom of thunder rattled the hinges, but beneath it came the unmistakable crash of hooves against wet earth, growing closer. The air inside the cabin thickened, alive with a tension none of them understood. Jack unlatched the door just as the world outside flared white with lightning. For a heartbeat, he saw it. A massive stallion, coat black as midnight rain, surging through the yard. Its mane whipped like a dark flag, and steam burst from its nostrils in violent clouds. Then the light was gone, and only the sound remained. A furious pounding, closer, closer, until the stallion was upon them. The door flew open. Wind hurled rain inside, scattering hay, knocking the lantern sideways. Ethan scrambled to right it, while Jack braced himself against the frame. And in that chaos, the stallion entered. It crashed through the doorway in a spray of water and mud, its hooves thundering across the wooden floor. The foals shrieked, pressed against the walls, eyes white with terror. Rose reared, Dusty spun, Blue tried to disappear into the boards. The room that had once been a sanctuary turned into a battlefield of fear. Jack stood his ground. The flashlight beam caught the stallion's flank, and he saw it then. A gash along the shoulder, raw and bleeding, a deep scar of violence that rain hadn't washed clean. The horse favored its right leg, holding it just enough off the ground to betray the pain. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, eyes wide, breath caught in his throat. "What do we do?" he whispered, barely audible over the storm. Jack didn't answer right away. He watched the stallion's eyes, dark, sharp, and alive with a desperate fire. This was no tame creature gone astray. This was wildness itself, battered but unbroken, forcing its way into the only refuge it could find. Slowly, Jack lowered the flashlight, raising his empty hand instead. "Easy, boy," he said, voice low, steady. "You came here for a reason. Let's not waste it." The stallion tossed its head, spraying water across the room, and stamped once, twice, hard enough to make the floor quiver. The foals whimpered. Ethan swallowed hard, but he didn't move. His knuckles whitened where he clutched the stall rail, but he held his ground. Jack took a cautious step forward. The stallion's ears flicked back, then forward, weighing him the way men weigh enemies across a battlefield. Lightning lit the room again, and for a split second Jack saw his own reflection in those eyes. Weary, scarred, unwilling to bow. Another crash of thunder shook the walls. The stallion reared, hooves striking air, shadow towering against the ceiling. Ethan cried out, but Jack's voice cut through the chaos. "Stay down, boy. Let me handle this." He moved closer, boots steady, every gesture deliberate. His heart hammered, but his face stayed calm. "You're hurt. I can see it. And you're scared. That makes two of us." The stallion landed heavily, sides heaving, water dripping from its black coat onto the boards. For a moment, silence hung between man and beast, broken only by the storm raging outside. Then, in that fragile pause, the stallion did not bolt. Jack extended his hand farther, palm open, fingers loose. He didn't expect the horse to take it, not yet. But he offered it anyway, the way he had once offered the same hand to 3 frightened foals, the way he had once offered it to a boy at the fence. Ethan's whisper was almost lost in the storm. "Mr. Turner, it's staying." Jack didn't move. didn't breathe too deeply. He knew trust, once shattered, took more than words to repair. But something about the stallion's stance, trembling, bleeding, yet unyielding, told him this was not an invasion. It was a plea. "Welcome in, stranger," Jack said softly, as rain hammered the roof. "Let's see if this house is big enough for one more lost soul." Rain hammered the tin roof with a fury that felt endless, but inside the cabin a strange stillness had fallen. The massive black stallion stood in the center of the room, sides heaving, eyes bright with defiance and pain. Steam rose from his body, carrying the smell of wet earth and iron blood. Jack didn't move. He kept his hand outstretched, palm up, fingers loose, as though the simple gesture could bridge the unbridgeable. Ethan stayed pressed against the wall, breath shallow. The foals crowded into corners, trembling but silent now, watching the intruder with wide, unblinking eyes. It was as if the whole room had fallen under a spell, every heartbeat waiting on the stallion's decision. Jack let the seconds stretch. He knew better than to rush. A wild horse lived on instinct, and instinct didn't forgive impatience. He lowered his voice to a murmur, words steady, almost like prayer. "Easy, boy. You came here because something out there was worse than in here. You're safe now. I promise." The stallion tossed its head, droplets scattering into the lamplight. His ears flicked back, then forward again, testing the sound of Jack's voice, the cadence of calm. Slowly, tentatively, he shifted his weight, favoring the injured leg, and took one half step closer. The floor creaked beneath his hoof, and Ethan sucked in a sharp breath. Jack didn't glance back. "Steady," he whispered, not to the horse alone, but to everyone in the room. His hand remained steady, suspended in the charged air between them. The stallion lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring. A hot breath washed across Jack's palm, moist, sharp with the scent of grass half digested, the rawness of an animal that had run too far, too fast. For a heartbeat, that was all. The breath, the fragile space between fear and trust. Then, almost imperceptibly, the stallion allowed Jack's fingers to graze his muzzle. The coarse hair was damp and trembling beneath his touch, but it was contact, real, undeniable. Ethan gasped, his voice breaking the hush. "He let you." "Quiet," Jack murmured, though not harshly. His eyes stayed on the horse, his hand gentle as he let it rest along the bridge of the muzzle, never pressing, never claiming. This is his choice, not mine. For a long moment, man and stallion remained like that, two silhouettes carved by lightning and shadow. Jack felt the heat of the animal's breath against his skin, the pulse of life in the great body before him. And somewhere deep in his chest, where loneliness had lived for years, something shifted. The stallion snorted suddenly, jerking his head back. Jack let his hand fall without protest, giving space. Trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned again and again. But the look in those dark eyes had changed. The fire remained, but it was tempered now with something else, recognition, however fleeting. The foals stirred. Rose took a tentative step forward, ears twitching. Dusty pawed once, uncertain, while Blue peeked out from behind the boards, drawn despite her fear. The stallion turned his massive head toward them, nostrils flaring, but made no move to threaten. He only stood, muscles taut, watching as if he, too, were weighing whether this fragile peace could last. Jack exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what had just happened. He turned to Ethan. "Get me the clean rag from the shelf," We'll see what we can do about that shoulder, Ethan obeyed, hurrying across the room, eyes still locked on the horse. He handed the rag to Jack with both hands, whispering, "He's really staying, isn't he?" Jack glanced back at the stallion, who had lowered his head again, watching them with an expression too human to name. "For now," Jack said. "For now, that's enough." He dipped the rag into the bucket of water, wrung it out, and moved slowly back toward the horse. Each step was deliberate, each gesture measured. When he reached the wound, he lifted the rag so the stallion could see and smell it first. Only when the horse didn't flinch did Jack press the cloth gently against the torn flesh. Blood welled, diluted pink, as the water washed it away. The stallion shuddered, but didn't strike. His breath came harder, ears flicking back, then forward again. Jack murmured, the same steady words, not caring what they meant, only how they sounded. "Easy now." "This won't last long. Just hold on." Ethan crept closer, peering at the gash. "Looks bad." "Bad enough," Jack admitted, "but not worse than he can bear." He pressed the rag again, firm but careful, feeling the tremor of power beneath the skin. Outside, the storm raged on. Wind howled through the trees, rain battered the walls, thunder cracked so loud it rattled every nail in the house. But inside, in that circle of lamplight, man and beast stood together, bound by the smallest of gestures. A hand, a breath, a fragile willingness to trust. When Jack finally stepped back, the rag stained dark in his hand. The stallion did not retreat. Instead, he shifted slightly, angling his great body toward the fire, as though he had decided, at least for this night, to share their shelter. Jack dropped the rag into the bucket, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion he hadn't felt in years. He glanced at Ethan, whose face glowed with awe and disbelief. "We'll call him Ash," Jack said quietly. "Like what's left after the fire. Burned, but not gone." The name seemed to hang in the air, absorbed by the walls, the Foals, and the storm itself. The stallion blinked once, slowly, as though he'd heard, and in some way, accepted. Ethan whispered it too, tasting the word. Ash. And with that, the house no longer felt invaded. It felt altered, remade, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. The storm finally eased toward dawn, leaving the land washed raw and new. The rain had scrubbed the air clean, and through the cracks of the shutters a pale gray light crept in. Jack sat slouched in his chair near the fire, boots still damp, shirt clinging to his shoulders. He hadn't slept. Across from him, the stallion stood, massive, dark, a silhouette against the dim glow of dying embers. For a long while, neither moved. It was as if both man and beast had entered into an unspoken pact of silence, acknowledging that survival itself was enough for one night. Jack studied the animal in the half-light, the glisten of wet hair, the ragged wound across the shoulder, the subtle tremor in the injured leg. Yet what caught him most was the stillness in those eyes. Wild, yes. Wounded, certainly. But not broken. Ethan stirred from his makeshift bed on the floor, rubbing his eyes. He looked toward the stallion first thing, and a faint smile tugged at his mouth. "He's still here," Jack grunted. "For now." The boy sat up, pulling the blanket around his shoulders. "You called him Ash last night." Jack leaned forward, poking the fire until sparks flared. "Seem to fit?" He glanced at the stallion. "What's left after the fire?" "Black, but still warm. Burned, but still alive. Ethan whispered the name, almost reverently. Ash. As if in response, the stallion shifted his weight, lowering his head just slightly. The movement, deliberate, measured. Jack didn't miss it. He'd lived too long around animals not to see when a gesture meant something. Might be he accepts it, he said. The foals, less fearful now, began to venture closer. Rose sniffed the air, her curiosity overcoming her nerves. Dusty pranced around, tossing his head as though challenging the newcomer. Blue lingered at the edge, cautious but no longer trembling. Ash watched them all with the bearing of a king displaced, a leader without a herd. Jack rose carefully, joints stiff from the long night. He retrieved the small tin box where he kept his few medical supplies. Bandages, salve, an old bottle of antiseptic. Time to see what we can do for him, he said. Ethan scrambled to help, holding the lantern higher. Jack approached Ash with slow, deliberate steps. The stallion's ears flicked, but he didn't bolt. When Jack lifted the cloth, Ash sniffed it, then stood firm as the man pressed it gently to the wound. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with smoke from the hearth. Ash flinched but did not strike, his massive body trembling only once before steadying again. That's it, Jack murmured. You've got fight left, I can see it. Ethan leaned close, eyes wide with wonder. He trusts you. Jack shook his head. Not yet. But he's thinking about it. They worked until the wound was clean and wrapped, the injured leg rubbed with liniment Jack had bartered from a rancher months ago. By the time they finished, dawn had broken fully, spilling soft gold through the slats. The rain had stopped. Outside, the earth glistened, puddles catching light like fragments of broken glass. Ethan went to the door and pulled it open. Fresh air swept in, cool and heavy with the smell of wet mesquite. Ash lifted his head, nostrils flaring, as though testing the world he had fled. For a moment, Jack feared he might bolt back into the wild, leave as suddenly as he had arrived. But the stallion only snorted, then turned back toward the fire. Jack felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of warmth he hadn't allowed himself in years. He thought of the mortgage notice still folded on the table, the attorney letters he ignored, the worries that had stacked higher than hay bales. All of it seemed smaller now in the presence of this wounded giant who had chosen, if only for one morning, to stay. The boy lingered by the open door, watching Ash with something like devotion. He belongs here, Ethan said softly. Jack looked at the stallion, at the foals gathered near his legs, at the scar across his shoulder shining white against the black. He didn't answer right away. But inside, he knew the boy was right. Later, when the sun had risen and the storm's memory faded into mud and scattered branches, Jack stepped outside to the porch. The land stretched wide, shimmering under the pale sky, everything washed clean but fragile. Behind him came the sound of hooves on wood. Ash, moving cautiously through the doorway, his massive frame filling the entrance. Jack turned, meeting those dark eyes. "You're Ash," he said again, more firmly now. "And if you'll have it, this place is yours too." The stallion lowered his head once, as though acknowledging the truth of it. Inside the house, the foals pressed closer, and Ethan grinned. And for the first time since his wife's laughter had filled these rooms, Jack felt the house alive with something larger than survival, something like belonging. The morning after the storm carried a fragile stillness, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Puddles lay scattered across the dirt yard, reflecting the pale sky. The cottonwoods dripped steadily, their branches bowing under the weight of leftover rain. Inside the cabin, however, another kind of stillness reigned, the kind born of exhaustion after survival. Ash stood near the hearth, his coat drying in the gentle warmth of the fire. The stallion's presence dominated the room without effort. His black hide gleamed faintly, broken only by the ragged white bandage Jack had tied across his left shoulder. When he shifted, the cloth slipped slightly, revealing the long scar beneath, a thin, pale streak that cut diagonally through muscle and flesh. It wasn't new. It had healed once before, only to be torn open again. Ethan stared at it, unable to look away. "Who could do that?" he whispered. Jack didn't answer right away. He pressed the edge of the bandage back into place, fingers steady despite the ache in his hands. "Doesn't matter right now," he said finally. "What matters is keeping it clean." They both turned at the sound of a truck crunching over wet gravel outside. The engine cut off, and a moment later, a woman in a faded denim jacket stepped onto the porch. Her gray-streaked hair was tied back, and a weathered leather bag swung from her shoulder. "Jack Turner," she called, rapping lightly on the doorframe before entering. "You've gone and done it again, haven't you?" Jack managed a half-smile. "Morning, Lila." Dr. Lila Brooks had been the county's go-to veterinarian for 20 years. She knew every rancher, every stray, every beast in trouble within 50 miles. She stepped inside, eyes immediately locking on the stallion. Her mouth tightened. "That's no foal." "No," Jack admitted. "Came in with the storm." Lila approached cautiously, her gaze sharp and clinical. Ash lifted his head, ears flicking back, but he didn't rear. He only watched, nostrils flaring, as she set down her bag and snapped on a pair of gloves. "He's wild," she muttered, more to herself than to Jack. "And that shoulder? Good Lord." Ethan spoke before Jack could. "He let us clean it." Pride tinged the boy's voice, though he kept it hushed. Lila glanced at him, then at Jack. "You realize what you've taken on? This isn't like raising 3 orphans. This one's a fighter. And he's been through something ugly." Jack didn't flinch. "I've been through ugly too." For a moment, silence stretched. Rain tapped against the windows, and the smell of antiseptic filled the air as Lila opened her bag. She pulled out clean bandages, a vial of antibiotics, and a syringe. "If he'll allow it, this will help." The process was slow. Jack kept a hand on Ash's muzzle, murmuring low, steady words, while Lila worked. Ethan held the lantern higher, his young face drawn tight with concentration. Ash shuddered when the needle pierced, muscles bunching beneath black skin, but he did not strike. His eyes, dark as coal, locked onto Jack's the entire time, as though daring him to betray the fragile trust between them. When it was done, Lila sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow. "You've got yourself a miracle," she said quietly. "I've seen wild horses run themselves to death before they'd step this close to a human. Whatever he's been through, he chose you." Don't ask me why Jack stroked the stallion's neck, feeling the heat beneath damp hair. Maybe because we're both too stubborn to quit. Lila stood, gathering her things. "I'll check back in a few days. Keep the wound clean. Don't push him. And Jack, be careful. A scar like that doesn't just mark the body. It marks the memory." Her words lingered long after her truck disappeared down the muddy road. Jack sat in his chair, Ethan beside him, both watching Ash. The stallion shifted his weight, settling into the firelight, his bandaged shoulder gleaming white against black hide. Ethan leaned close. "She's right, isn't she?" That scar means something more. Jack didn't answer. He thought of his own scars, the ones no one could see. Nights of silence, years of loss, the weight of choices made and unmade. He looked at the stallion, at the defiance still burning in his eyes, and felt an uncomfortable kinship. "Scars don't tell you where you'll go," Jack said finally. "Just where you've been. What matters now is whether he'll stay." Ash blew out a long breath, ears flicking forward, and lowered his head toward the foals. Rose stepped closer without fear. Dusty sniffed, and even Blue inched forward, drawn despite her shyness. The sight made Ethan smile. Small, but real. Jack leaned back, letting the moment speak for itself. For the first time since the storm, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like the beginning of something neither man nor beast could yet name. The Texas sun rose hard and bright, erasing the last dampness left by the storm. By mid-morning, the air shimmered with heat again, the earth drying as though the downpour had been only a dream. Jack sat on the porch steps with a chipped mug of coffee, his hat tipped low, watching as the world reset itself. The smell of wet mesquite lingered faintly, sharp and clean, but already the dust was returning. Inside the house, a different kind of quiet had taken hold. Ash stood in the center of the room, his dark body gleaming now that his coat had dried. The fresh bandage on his shoulder glowed white against black hide, like a signature he carried without choice. Around him, the foals moved cautiously, but no longer with terror. Rose approached in bold steps, sniffing his flank before tossing her head as if to say she had claimed him. Dusty circled with restless energy, testing boundaries, while Blue lingered at a respectful distance, but kept her eyes fixed on him. Jack stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath his boots. He paused, taking in the strange tableau. The stallion, wild and wounded, surrounded by 3 young lives who had already accepted his presence. For a moment, it looked like a photograph, motion suspended, meaning hidden in posture and light. He wondered if someone else might see only animals in a room, but he saw more. He saw belonging, fragile and incomplete, but real. Ethan arrived just before noon, walking up the path with a crooked grin and his shirt already damp from chores at home. "Morning, Mr. Turner," he called, slipping inside without hesitation. His eyes lit at the sight of Ash, who raised his head but didn't move away. "He stayed," Ethan said, voice filled with quiet amazement. Jack grunted, though a small satisfaction stirred in his chest. "For now." The boy went straight to the foals, kneeling to check the water trough. Dusty shoved his nose into Ethan's shoulder, nearly knocking him over. Ethan laughed, steadying himself with a hand on the stallion's leg. Ash didn't flinch. His ears flicked back briefly, then forward again, as though deciding the boy was no threat. "See that?" Ethan whispered. He didn't move. Jack busied himself with spreading hay, hiding the faint smile that tugged at his mouth. Trust wasn't a declaration. It was built in these small moments, gestures that might look like nothing to anyone else. The day stretched slow. Heat pressed against the cabin, and Jack kept the shutters half closed to trap cool air. Ethan swept the floor, humming tunelessly, while Jack mended a broken strap with an old needle and waxed thread. Ash shifted only to adjust his weight, his dark figure a steady shadow near the fire pit, even though no fire burned. By mid-afternoon, the world outside was silent except for the low drone of insects. Dust motes swirled lazily in shafts of light, slipping through the shutters. Rose nibbled at the edge of Ethan's shirt. Dusty pawed rhythmically at the floor, and Blue finally crept close enough to sniff Ash's tail. The stallion merely flicked it once in mild annoyance, nothing more. It was such a simple scene, yet Jack felt the weight of it. For years, his house had been a place of absence, empty chairs, quiet halls, silence heavy enough to choke. Now it was alive with movement, a boy's laughter, the steady breath of horses, the rustle of hay. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the rhythm, as though life had finally remembered to pass through these walls. At one point, Ethan asked, "What happens when he's better? When he doesn't need us anymore?" Jack looked at Ash, at the proud line of his neck, the scar glinting pale against black. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "That's not our decision. If he leaves, he leaves. If he stays, he stays. All we can do is give him a reason to want this roof over his head." Ethan nodded, though his brow furrowed. He reached for Blue, coaxing her closer, as if proving to himself that trust could be built, not borrowed. The evening came gentle, with a sunset that painted the sky in streaks of copper and rose. Jack stepped onto the porch again, mug now filled with cool water instead of coffee. The land smelled faintly sweet, a mix of hay and damp soil. Behind him, through the doorway, he saw Ethan dozing against a wall, the foals curled near him, and Ash standing sentinel like a dark statue. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the stillness sink into him. It was fragile, yes. It might not last. But tonight, at least, it was theirs. And as he listened to the steady rhythm of breathing inside, he realized that sometimes a day didn't need grand events to matter. Sometimes a day could be still as a photograph, holding all the proof you needed that life had changed. The stillness did not last. By nightfall, the horizon had grown restless again, clouds crawling back over the plains like an army regrouping. The heat of the day had been thick and airless, the kind that often snapped into violence after sunset. Jack felt it in his bones when he stepped outside to draw water. The heaviness, the electric charge that raised the hair on his arms. Inside, the foals shifted uneasily. Rose stamped her hoof, ears twitching at a rumble far off. Dusty circled his corner as though the floorboards had turned to fire. Blue pressed close to Ethan, who sat cross-legged beside her, stroking her neck. Even Ash seemed unsettled, his massive body tense, ears flicking like antennae tuned to something humans could not yet hear. Jack set the bucket down with more force than he intended. "Storm's rolling back," he muttered. Ethan looked up from the floor. "Another one?" "Texas doesn't do half measures," Jack said, pulling the shutters tight. "When it rains, it roars." The first crack of thunder came sudden and brutal, rattling the window panes. The lantern flame quivered, shadows lunging across the walls. Ash snorted, tossing his head, hooves striking the boards in sharp warning. His eyes flashed in the lamplight, wide and white. "Easy," Jack murmured, stepping forward, hand out. "You're safe." But the storm had other ideas. A jagged spear of lightning lit the room in harsh silver, revealing every scar, every ragged edge of the house. The boom that followed shook the rafters, a sound too much like a gunshot. Ash reared, his massive frame rising toward the low ceiling, hooves pawing at the air. The foals shrieked. Dusty bolted sideways, knocking into Rose, who kicked back in panic. Blue scrambled against the boards, eyes wild. Ethan shouted, trying to calm them, but his voice was drowned by the roar of the storm. Jack lunged forward, heart pounding. "Ash!" he barked, voice firm as command. But the stallion was beyond hearing. Fear had hollowed him out, leaving only instinct. He came down hard, hooves striking the floor with a crack that reverberated through the cabin. The old wooden chair Jack had used for years stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. It splintered under the blow, pieces flying. Ethan ducked, shielding his head. Jack wasn't as quick. A shard of wood caught his side as he stumbled backward, sending him crashing against the table. Pain exploded through his ribs, sharp and merciless. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to cry out, but the sound that escaped was a guttural groan. Ash reared again, eyes rolling white, body twisting dangerously close to the Foals. Jack forced himself upright, clutching the table for balance. Every breath stabbed his chest, but he pushed forward, raising both hands. "Look at me," he commanded, voice breaking but loud enough to cut through the storm. "Not the sky, not the noise, me!" For one suspended second, Ash hesitated. His front hooves hovered above the ground, muscles straining, then slammed down just inches from Rose. The foal squealed, darting to Ethan's arms. Ash's nostrils flared, chest heaving, but his gaze finally locked on Jack. The room held its breath. Jack stood trembling, sweat mixing with rain that had forced its way through the shutters, his hands raised in surrender and authority at once. He didn't move closer. He only held the stallion's eyes. "Not your enemy," he rasped, pain lacing every word. "Not tonight." The stallion's sides quivered. Slowly, achingly, his front leg lifted, then lowered in a stomp that was more warning than attack. His ears flicked, his breathing slowed a fraction. Then, with a final snort, he backed a step away from the Foals. Jack's knees buckled. He clutched the table, chest screaming with pain. Ethan rushed to him, face pale. "You're hurt." Jack waved him off, though his hand shook. "I'll live." His eyes stayed on Ash, who still trembled, sweat streaking his black coat. "It's him we have to calm." The boy looked from man to stallion, fear and determination warring in his young face. He swallowed, then stepped forward, voice steady despite the quake in his hands. "It's okay, Ash. It's just noise. Just light. We're here. We're not leaving." The words were simple, but they fell into the room like anchors. Ash's ears tilted forward, his breathing eased another notch. His great head lowered, though his muscles remained taut as wire. Jack sagged into the boy's shoulder, the world tilting around him. He thought of the insurance letters, the mortgage notices still sitting unanswered on the shelf. Reminders of how fragile everything was. But at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was this boy holding steady, these foals huddled in the corner, and this stallion fighting terror with trust. Another crack of thunder shook the house, but this time Ash only flinched. He did not rear. He only pressed closer to the hearth, dark eyes fixed on Jack, as though tethered to him by invisible rope. Jack closed his eyes, every breath jagged, ribs aflame. But his words came soft, steady, the way they had the night the stallion first arrived. "You're all right, boy. We all are. Just hold on." And somehow, in the wreckage of broken wood and splintered silence, the room steadied. The storm still raged, but inside the fragile walls of that cabin, the worst of the chaos had passed. The storm broke some time before dawn, but Jack wasn't awake to notice when the thunder stopped. Pain had folded him into a shallow sleep at the kitchen table, his arm draped across his ribs like a shield. When his eyes opened again, the room was washed in a pale, almost unreal light. It spilled through the cracks of the shutters, turning the air inside the cabin into a hushed silver. He shifted, a hiss escaping his teeth. Every breath reminded him of last night's chaos. The wild hooves, the shattering wood, the sickening twist when his body hit the floor. His side throbbed as though a hot brand had been pressed into him. He reached for the chipped mug on the table, but found only cold ashes where the fire had burned out. The Foals were the first thing he checked. Rose dozed near the corner, ears flicking occasionally in dreams. Dusty lay sprawled awkwardly on the hay, finally spent after hours of frantic pacing. Blue was curled tight against Ethan, who had fallen asleep sitting upright, his head tipped back against the wall, lips parted in soft snores. And then there was Ash. The stallion stood in the center of the room, still and silent, his black coat gleaming faintly in the morning glow. The white bandage on his shoulder was smudged from the night's struggle, but it held. His head was lowered, eyes not closed but soft, watching everything with the weariness of a creature that had fought too hard. Jack tried to rise. His knees trembled, and the room spun before steadying again. Ash lifted his head instantly, ears forward, nostrils flaring. The stallion took one step closer, not in threat, but in something else, a gesture Jack struggled to name. Concern? Protection? "Don't fuss," Jack muttered, gripping the chair to steady himself. "I've seen worse." Still, Ash lingered. When Jack took another step, his legs nearly gave. This time, Ash pressed forward, his flank brushing Jack's shoulder, steadying him. The warmth of that contact seeped through Jack's bones, a silent exchange louder than words. Ethan stirred at the sound, blinking awake. He rubbed his eyes, saw the scene, and whispered, "He's helping you." Jack grunted, though his throat tightened. Maybe he's just keeping me from falling on him again. But the truth burned clearer than the sunlight seeping through the shutters. The stallion had chosen to steady him. The morning outside was dazzling. When Jack finally managed to open the door, the land lay blanketed in a thin crust of white hailstones scattered like pearls. The sky was sharp blue, the air so crisp it cut clean into his lungs. Every branch of the cottonwoods dripped with melted silver, and the dirt road glittered with puddles reflecting the sky. It looked less like destruction, and more like a strange rebirth, the storm's violence disguised in beauty. Ethan joined him on the porch, Blue peeking out timidly from behind. "It's like the world got wiped clean," the boy said. Jack leaned against the doorframe, wincing as he shifted. Storms do that sometimes. Tear everything apart, then leave it shining behind them. Ash stepped onto the threshold. His coat caught the sunlight, black as midnight but rimmed in fire. He lifted his head, nostrils wide, testing the air. The Foals pressed behind him, cautious but curious, as if waiting for him to decide whether the world was safe again. Jack watched them all, his hand pressed against his ribs. Looks like they're taking their lead from him. Ethan smiled faintly, like he's their big brother. The boy's words lingered as the morning stretched on. They tended to chores slowly, every movement deliberate. Ethan carried water and spread hay, while Jack measured out small handfuls of grain. Ash allowed the boy to brush the mud from his flank, a privilege not lightly given. Rose nosed against the stallion's side. Dusty pranced at his heels, and even Blue ventured closer than she ever had before. By midday, the cabin felt different. The jagged memory of fear had dulled, replaced by a fragile peace. Jack sat heavily in his chair, watching Ethan laugh when Dusty tried to steal his cap again. Ash stood near the open door, eyes sweeping the horizon, his body both sentinel and shelter. Jack pressed a hand to his side, the pain sharp but bearable. He knew the injury would keep him from working as he once had. He knew the bills still piled on the table, but as he watched the stallion lower his great head so Blue could sniff his muzzle without fear, Jack felt something shift. The storm had scarred them all in different ways, but in its aftermath, in this white morning that looked more like blessing than curse, it had also bound them tighter together. For the first time in years, Jack didn't feel like the only guardian in the house. He had help now, from a boy who refused to give up, from 3 foals who demanded care, and from a black stallion who had chosen, against every instinct, to stay. By late afternoon, the heat had thinned into a softer kind of light, the sort that made every edge of the world look forgiving. Jack stood in the doorway with his palm on the jamb, testing how much his ribs would tolerate. The porch boards were warm under his boots. The smell of wet mesquite had faded to dust and sun. Inside, Ethan swept hay into neat rows, while the foals dozed, their ears twitching at dreams only horses know. Ash waited a few steps behind Jack, the bandage on his left shoulder bright as chalk against the black of his coat. He had stood most of the day like that, sentinel, steady, watching every time Jack shifted, as if ready to catch him should the world tilt again. Now the stallion lifted his head toward the open yard, nostrils tasting the air. A breeze touched his mane, and it fanned across his neck like ink in water. "You can go if you want," Jack said, not sure if the horse would hear the meaning, but saying it anyway. "Door's open." Ethan looked up from the broom. "You mean it?" Jack's hand pressed gently into his side, where pain still smoldered. He nodded. He came through that storm on his own feet. He ought to be free to decide where they take him. The words sat heavy in his mouth, tasting of old goodbyes. He thought of folded envelopes on the table, mortgage notices, insurance forms, a letter from a county attorney about a boundary dispute 3 properties over. Paper troubles waited like coyotes at the fence line. He could handle them later. Now was about breath and choice. Ash stepped forward until his shadow pooled on the threshold. The house held its breath with him. Beyond the porch lay open pasture glazed with 1,000 tiny mirrors of leftover hail, and farther still, the mesquite hills the color of dried tea. The gate at the far edge of the yard had been left unlatched when the storm rushed them all inside. It sagged now, an accidental invitation. The stallion placed one hoof on the porch plank, then another. He paused when the board creaked, head turning to check the room behind him. The boy, the foals, the man, with a look so intent it made Jack's throat tighten. "Go on," Jack said, softer. "No rope here." Ash descended to the yard. Sun fired along the curve of his back. He walked with the careful grace of a creature that had learned the price of running, each step measured, each breath considered. Rose rose to her feet inside the house, worrying, then settled when Ethan murmured to her. Dusty wuffed and took 2 quick steps after the stallion before thinking better of it. Blue stayed pressed to the wall, eyes following the line of Ash's tail. Jack stayed in the doorway for as long as his ribs allowed, watching Ash test the hard pan with a forehoof, then cross the yard toward the open gate. He felt Ethan slide beside him, thin shoulder warm against his arm. "Should I close it?" the boy asked. Jack shook his head. "If you close it, you're deciding for him. Men do enough deciding for things they don't understand." The stallion reached the gate and stopped. The breeze flipped, the unlatched board against the post, and it clapped once, a wooden heartbeat in the silence. Ash lifted his head as if listening for something only he could hear. Beyond the fence, the world stretched wide and unpromised. Dry arroyos, thorn and stone, the long seam of the horizon stitched to a pale sky. He could vanish into it within minutes. A dark pulse swallowed by light. Ethan's fingers tightened on the broom handle. "If he goes, then he goes," Jack said, and meant it, though the words rasped like sand against his ribs. He had lost bigger things than a horse. He had also learned what returns when you leave the door open. Ash tipped one ear toward the house. He did not move. Time lengthened until even the flies seemed to hover in thought. Then, with a breath that visibly eased his massive ribs, the stallion turned, not away, but back. He took 3 steps toward the porch, each one quicker than the last, as if the decision, once made, wanted to be finished. Ethan smiled without showing his teeth, the way you smile at a skittish cat. "He's coming home," the boy said, and then flushed at his own certainty. Home. The word landed on Jack's chest and settled there like a warm hand. He eased away from the door and stepped onto the porch as Ash reached the bottom step. The stallion stopped, waiting, not for an order, not for a bribe of apples, just for acknowledgement. Jack extended his palm and let it hover, not touching, an old ritual repeated new. Ash bridged the distance. His muzzle found the space between Jack's palm and chest and filled it. The breath that rolled over Jack's skin was velvet warm, heavy with the sweet acid of hay and the metal of water from the old well. It smelled like work and survival and mornings that start too early and end too fast. It smelled, somehow, like the past refusing to be the whole story. Jack didn't speak. He let the breath cover his knuckles, his wrist, his heart. Up close, he could see the silk thread of the white scar on Ash's left shoulder, a tidy seam under the bandage where Lila's clean hands had guided healing. The stallion's eye, dark, bright, held him the way the horizon sometimes holds a man who has forgotten how to lift his head. "I hear you," Jack said at last. The words were small, but they seemed to belong in this quiet. "You do what you need. We'll keep a light on inside." The cabin stirred. Rose nosed the broom from Ethan's hands. Dusty rattled the bucket to see if courage tasted like grain. Blue crept forward until her chin rested on the door sill, eyes peering at the world from the safest edge of it. The room looked like itself, and also like something new, as if the storm had rearranged the furniture of their lives into a shape they did not know they needed. Ash lifted his head and, with a careful patience that felt almost human, climbed the 2 porch steps. His hooves found the old grooves worn by decades of boots. He paused with his front half, in shadow, his hindquarters still in late sun, a creature literally between worlds. And then chose. He moved forward until the threshold cut across his belly, and the house drew his shadow fully inside. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thought he'd bolt. Jack shook his head. He already did. Last night. This is something else. They watered the foals and spread hay. Ethan fetched a currycomb and, with a reverence that never looked like fear, brushed along Ash's neck where the sweat had dried into salt. The stallion stood quiet under the touch, occasionally flicking an ear toward the door as if to check that it was still open. It was. Jack would keep it that way. Evening fell soft. The radio on the shelf found a station out of Abilene and gave them old hymns sung through a veil of static. Jack didn't sing. His ribs had not forgiven him. But he hummed low while he collected the splinters of the chair Ash had broken. He saved the bigger pieces and planed one edge smooth with a pocket knife, thinking he might fashion a short bench out of it, something closer to the ground where a man could rest without testing a cracked body. The job asked for patience more than skill, the sort of work a person could do while listening to weather in the boards and animals breathing. When he set the knife down, Ash was at the doorway again. The stallion's head turned toward the yard, taking a last measure of the open world before night closed it. Jack stepped beside him. Cool air slid across their faces. Somewhere down the road, a truck shifted gears, then vanished into distance. "Tomorrow we start fresh," Jack said. "I'll mend that gate." The county will still want its papers signed. There'll be fences to fix and feed to stretch, and I might have to make some calls about that mortgage, maybe even look into an online degree for Ethan if the boy keeps showing up with that stubborn look in his eyes. Life's not simple, Ash, but it's honest if you let it be. The stallion's breath warmed Jack's cheek in answer. A small thing, the kind that changes everything. Behind them, Ethan clicked off the lamp. The last light fell in a thin river across the threshold and pooled at Ash's feet. The stallion didn't step away. He held the line with Jack until the night was all the way itself, and the house carried the weight of them without complaint. Jack closed his eyes and let the ache in his ribs be what it was. The hurt was part of the story, not the ending. He touched the door with his fingertips, the way some men touch church walls. And he stood there with the horse and the boy and the gentle hush of animals finding sleep. When he finally spoke, it was barely sound. "I'm glad you came back." Ash didn't move. He only breathed, slow and certain, and in that warm breath at the threshold, the house found a heartbeat that felt like a promise kept. Morning came dry and bright, with the sun spilling across the plains like molten copper. Jack had woken early despite his ribs still aching from the storm. He sat on the porch bench he'd cobbled together from the broken chair, the wood rough but steady beneath him. His coffee steamed faintly, and in that rising curl of heat, he watched the yard stretch outward, mud hardened to clay, puddles shrinking under the day's new fire. Ash stood by the open doorway, his black coat gleaming as if the night had polished it. His bandaged shoulder showed signs of healing, though the scar beneath would never disappear. Rose nipped gently at his flank. Dusty pawed impatiently near his hooves, and even timid Blue edged close enough to brush against him. The stallion endured it all, eyes half closed, as if weighing what it meant to belong. Ethan arrived with a burst of breath and dust, running harder than usual down the path. His face was lit with something urgent. "Mr. Turner," he called, "there's a truck on the road." "County Inspector. My uncle said he was headed here." Jack set the mug down, the weight in his chest deepening. Of course. Minutes later, a man in a crisp shirt and dust-stained boots stepped into the yard, clipboard under one arm. He had the official air of someone used to measuring lives with boxes and signatures. "Jack Turner," he said flatly. "Got reports you're housing livestock inside your residence." Not exactly standard practice, Jack didn't rise from the bench. "They're not livestock. They're orphans." The inspector's eyes flicked toward Ash, towering and black, mane shifting in the light breeze. His lips pressed into a thin line. "That one isn't a foal. That's a wild stallion. Dangerous. You can't just—" "He came to me," Jack interrupted. His voice was steady, but his ribs throbbed with each word. "In the middle of a storm. Hurt and bleeding. He stays because he wants to. I'm not chaining him here." Ethan stepped forward, broom still in his hand from morning chores. His voice cracked, but carried. "He's not dangerous. He saved Mr. Turner when he almost fell. He looks after the foals." The inspector's pen scratched against the clipboard. "Rules are rules. County prefers animals like that placed in a holding facility or sanctuary. Liability otherwise. If he spooks, you'll lose more than broken chairs." Jack's jaw tightened. He thought of the letters stacked on his table. Mortgage payments overdue, insurance warnings folded and ignored, notices from an attorney about boundaries and debts, paper burdens that said his home was already half-claimed by people who'd never stood in this dirt. Now this man wanted to take what little peace had walked into his life on 4 legs. He pushed himself up slowly, steadying on the bench. "I'm not arguing law with you, but I won't shut a gate on something that came here for shelter. If he chooses to leave, that's his right. If he chooses to stay, that's mine to honor." The inspector sighed, tapping his pen against the board. "You're making this hard, Turner." "At least register. Fill the forms. Might buy you time." Jack didn't answer. Behind him, Ash shifted. The stallion had wandered toward the yard's edge, to the gate still sagging from storm damage. Sunlight lit him in full, every line of strength and scar. He paused there, massive head lifted, ears tilted toward the horizon. For one breathless moment, the world balanced on the silence of that choice. The foals crowded near the porch, Ethan clutching the broom like a weapon, the inspector with his pen frozen in mid-air. Jack, ribs aching, leaned forward as though to see clearer. Ash could have left. Beyond the gate, freedom stretched endless, dust plains, mesquite shadows, the call of wild things. He could have stepped through and vanished, proving every word the inspector had spoken. But instead, Ash turned. He lowered his head, ears soft, and walked back toward the porch. Each step was heavy with certainty, as though the earth itself recognized the decision. He stopped near Jack and exhaled, warm breath rolling over the man's sleeve. Jack lifted his hand and touched the stallion's scarred shoulder gently, letting silence speak louder than argument. The inspector scribbled something on his clipboard, muttered about case notes, and turned toward his truck. He left the gate unlatched behind him. Ethan's shoulders sagged with relief. He stayed. Jack didn't smile, but the lines of his face eased. For now. And that's enough. As the truck rumbled away, the stallion stood at the threshold once more, breathing steady, watching the horizon he had refused. The foals pressed against him like children to a guardian, and Ethan leaned into Jack's side without asking. Jack felt the ache in his ribs, the weight of debts waiting, the shadows of storms not yet come. But in that moment, With the gate left open and the stallion choosing to remain, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt hope dressed in black hide, with a scar across the shoulder and breath warm enough to steady a broken man. The next days stretched into a rhythm that felt almost new. The prairie baked under wide skies, heat shimmering above the road, cicadas rattling from every fence post. Jack worked slower than he used to, his ribs still stiff from the storm. But Ethan filled the gaps with the kind of tireless energy only a boy could summon. Together they mended troughs, shoveled hay, and checked the sagging fences. Dust clung to their boots, sweat darkened their shirts, but the work stitched them together. Ash moved among them like a shadow that had decided to stay. Each morning the stallion stepped onto the porch, surveying the yard with an air that was both watchful and calm. Rose followed him everywhere, nosing at his flank as though she had claimed him as kin. Dusty tested him constantly, darting forward and back, rearing in play. Blue grew braver too, inching closer until one afternoon she rested her head against his side, sighing as if she had found the safest place in the world. One afternoon, while Ethan hammered a loose shingle on the porch roof, Jack sat on the bench beneath him, sharpening an old blade. The boy's hammering echoed above, and with it came the steady whine of prairie wind funneling through the cottonwoods. The sound made Jack pause. For years he had sat here alone, listening to that same wind. It had always felt like emptiness. Now it sounded like accompaniment. "You think this roof will hold another storm?" Ethan asked, voice muffled by the nails he held between his lips. "Hold enough," Jack answered. "It's not about stopping the storm. It's about giving us time to get through it." The boy leaned over the edge, grinning down at him. "You always talk like there's a lesson hidden in the work." "Maybe there is," Jack said, a rare smile tugging his mouth. "The land doesn't give you much choice but to learn." Ash snorted from where he stood in the yard, tossing his mane as if to weigh in on the conversation. Ethan laughed, the sound clear as water. Jack let it roll through him, easing a corner of the ache that had lived in his chest for years. As the afternoon cooled, they led the foals outside the yard for the first time since the storms. The ground was dry enough now, the grasses greening faintly from recent rain. Jack leaned on a post, ribs aching but eyes alert, while Ethan guided Rose with a loose rope. Dusty bounded ahead, exuberant, and Blue trailed close to Ash, shadow to his shadow. The stallion walked with head high, ears swiveling, but he didn't bolt. He stayed with them, matching their pace, as if the open plains no longer pulled at him the way they once had. Neighbors drove by slowly on the dirt road, slowing their trucks to watch the sight. Jack Turner's ragged house, a boy in torn jeans, 3 foals, and a wild stallion striding like he belonged. Jack caught the glances, the raised brows, but he didn't care. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like the man left behind. He felt like part of something that might last. That evening they ate beans and cornbread on the porch. The prairie wind pressed against the roof in long sighs, fluttering the lamp flame. Ethan leaned back on his elbows, staring at the stars that crowded the sky once darkness fell. "Feels like the world's bigger when he's here," he said, nodding toward Ash. Jack looked at the stallion standing at the gate, black coat blending with the night, except for the pale bandage on his shoulder. "Or maybe we just notice it more," he said. The boy tilted his head. "Do you think he'll ever leave?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He thought of the mortgage envelope still waiting, of letters that spoke in the cold language of foreclosure and liability. He thought of how many times life had taken what he held, no matter how tightly. Then he looked at Ash, at the way the foals clustered near him, at the quiet patience in the stallion's stance. "Everything leaves eventually," Jack said softly, "but some things stay long enough to change you. That's what matters." The wind hummed through the rafters, filling the silence that followed. Ethan nodded slowly, as though he understood more than his years allowed. Ash turned his head toward the porch then, ears pricked forward, eyes catching the lamplight. He took one step closer, then another, until his breath mingled with theirs in the evening air. Jack felt the warmth of it, steady and grounding, like a promise whispered not in words, but in presence. The prairie wind rattled the roof again, but this time it didn't sound like loneliness. It sounded like a song meant for company. The morning came dry and sharp, the kind that made the horizon seem endless and the land itself brittle. Jack rose with care, his ribs still stiff, and stepped outside to find Ash already at the gate. The stallion's body caught the sun in long gleams, black hide rippling with every breath. Dust clung to his hooves, the faint print of last night's wanderings visible in the yard. He stood there like a sentinel at the edge of two worlds, the cabin behind him, the wide plains in front. Ethan followed with a bucket of water, setting it down carefully. The foals jostled one another for position, Rose bold, Dusty impatient, Blue hesitant as always. Ash barely glanced at them. His gaze was fixed outward, beyond the gate, on the line where the yard met the dust road. Jack felt the weight of it. "He's thinking again," he said. Ethan shaded his eyes. "About leaving?" "About choosing," Jack answered. They had left the gate unlatched since the inspector's visit. It sagged now, a crooked mouth open to the prairie. Jack had meant to fix it, but never found the will. Maybe, deep down, he wanted the stallion to decide without barriers. The day passed slow. Jack mended harness straps on the porch while Ethan carried feed, his whistle trailing off when chores grew heavy. Ash paced near the open gate, back and forth, each circuit cutting deeper lines into the dirt. Sometimes he stopped, ears forward, nostrils flaring to the wind as though catching scents of a herd somewhere far. Other times he turned back, pressing his muzzle to the foals' necks, letting them nip his mane as if to anchor him here. By mid-afternoon, the air grew heavy again, not with storm, but with the weight of decision. Even the cicadas quieted, their song dimming into background hum. Jack set his work aside and leaned on the porch rail, eyes fixed on the stallion. He thought of all the departures life had dealt him, his wife's last breath, friends who stopped calling, the steady erosion of land and pride under bills and signatures. He thought of what remained. This boy, these foals, this strange black horse who had walked into his life on the heels of thunder. Ethan came to stand beside him. "If he leaves," the boy began, but the words caught. Jack's voice was steady. "Then he leaves. That's the only way staying can mean anything." The stallion stopped at the gate. Dust swirled in the faint wind, drawing a crooked line across the yard. Ash planted his hooves on it, one inside, one out. The moment stretched, holding them all in suspension. The foals pressed against the fence, restless. Ethan's hand clenched the rail until his knuckles blanched. Ash lifted his head, ears flicking toward the open land. He shifted forward, one stride beyond the line, dust kicking under his weight. Jack's heart sank, but he did not move. He forced himself to honor the choice, whatever it was. Then, suddenly, Ash halted. He swung his great head back, eyes locking on Jack's. It was not a wild look, not the frantic flash of the first storm. It was clear, deliberate, and impossibly calm. The stallion snorted once, a sound that broke the silence, then stepped back across the line into the yard. His decision was simple, but it fell like a hammer against Jack's chest. Ethan exhaled sharply, a laugh and a sob tangled in one. He stayed. Jack nodded, his throat too tight for words. Ash walked past the foals, brushing against each in turn, then came to the porch. He lowered his head, pressing his breath against Jack's sleeve the way he had on that first night. The line in the dust remained, marking where freedom and belonging had met. But Ash had chosen, not because of fences or ropes, but because something here mattered more than the call of open plains. Jack laid his hand gently on the stallion's scarred shoulder. "Then we'll keep walking this road together," he whispered, more vow than statement. The wind rose, carrying dust across the yard, but the line stayed faintly visible until evening. And every time Jack's eyes found it, he felt the truth settle deeper. Some choices don't need words, only steps taken in the right direction. Evening descended in slow layers of color. The sky washed first in gold, then crimson, then the purple-gray that carried stars in its folds. The house, battered and patched, seemed to exhale under the changing light, as though even wood and nails understood it had survived storms greater than itself. Jack sat on the bench he had fashioned from broken pieces, his breath steady despite the ache still buried in his ribs. The porch boards were cool beneath his boots. Ethan came out with 2 tin plates, setting one beside Jack. The boy's shoulders looked broader than when he first appeared at the fence weeks ago. He had learned to carry water without spilling, to sweep hay with patience, to coax timid Blue with a hand that no longer shook. Jack watched him settle onto the step, plate balanced on his knees, and thought how time had carved its changes so quietly he hadn't noticed until now. Inside, the foals shifted. Rose nudged at the grain bucket. Dusty pawed impatiently. Blue leaned against the stall partition with eyes half closed. And then Ash stepped forward. The stallion filled the doorway, his black coat luminous under the glow of a lantern. The white seam of his scar caught the light, no longer raw, only a reminder of survival. He moved with the deliberate ease of something that had chosen to stay. Jack reached out, hand brushing the railing as Ash descended onto the porch. The stallion's breath rolled warm into the cooling air. He lowered his head toward Ethan, who laughed softly, not with surprise, but with the ease of one who expected the gesture. Blue crept from inside, pressing against Ash's flank, followed quickly by Rose and Dusty. The porch sagged under the weight, but it held. "Feels crowded," Ethan said, smiling. Jack looked around, at the boy beside him, at the foals clustering near, at the stallion towering above. He felt the roof above them, patched and weathered, yet broad enough to cover all. "Crowded isn't always bad," he said. "Sometimes it means you finally got enough." The boy tilted his head, considering that. The lantern flickered, painting long shadows across the yard, where the line in the dust still faintly marked Ash's choice. Beyond it, the prairie stretched empty and endless, but it no longer threatened. The gate remained unlatched, a silent invitation, but Ash had turned from it, choosing this porch, this roof, this fragile family. Jack rose carefully, ribs protesting, and set the empty plate aside. He placed his hand against the stallion's shoulder, fingers tracing the edge of the scar. Ash did not flinch. Instead, he leaned into the touch, breath steady, eyes dark but calm. Ethan watched, silent, as though he understood that some vows are spoken without words. The radio inside caught a signal, drifting faint notes of an old hymn through static. Jack didn't know the words anymore, but he hummed along, low and rough, letting it mingle with the sound of the prairie wind under the roof. The boy's head tilted against the rail, lids drooping with sleep. The Foals pressed closer, and Ash stood unmoving, sentinel and shelter both. Jack looked at them all, the unlikely collection of what had been abandoned or wounded or overlooked, gathered here under his roof. A farmer too poor to pay his debts, a boy too often left alone, 3 foals without mothers, and a stallion scarred by things no one dared name. Each had been broken in some way, but together they fit, not perfectly, but enough. The stars brightened above, scattered across the sky like seeds on tilled ground. Jack leaned back against the porch post, his hand still resting on Ash. "Roof's wide enough," he whispered, though no one had asked. "For all of us." Ash blew a long, soft breath, the sound rolling through the night like agreement. The porch held its silence after, but it was not the silence of absence. It was full, warm, and alive. And in that stillness, Jack understood what had changed. The storms would come again, bills would pile, work would break his body down further, but he would not face it alone. This house, patched, worn, improbable, was now a home. If this story touched your heart, let me know with a simple comment. Just type 0 if you felt the bond, or 1 if you believe every soul deserves a second chance. Don't forget to subscribe, because more stories of hope, healing, and the unbreakable ties between humans and horses are waiting for you in the next videos.